Hi. So the most common thing that people are discussing nowadays is the deficit and how the Fed is going to have to monetize the deficit because, as you've heard from both Jerome Powell and many people who've spoken up about this, they're talking about how the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path, right? So what this means, right, is that the U.S. government is spending more than they're bringing in revenue every single year, and it's resulting in well, as of right now, it's a $1.83 trillion deficit. So that means that the US government is borrowing 1.83 trillion, right, per year. Now, tariffs might offset some of that if it's true that tariffs can bring in 300 billion in revenue and the Fed funds rate drops a bit, which by the way is not up to the Federal Reserve, it's up to this, right? In blue, I've talked about this a billion times, but the blue line is the 2-year treasury yield and the red line is the Fed funds rate. So the bond market dictates whether short-term interest rates are going to drop or not. It's not up for the Fed to decide that. Now, Donald Trump and many other politicians and people who are talking about this publicly are wrong when they say that if the Fed funds rate drops to 1%, then they're going to save $1 trillion in interest every year. That's not true because most of it is not affected by the Fed funds rate. It's long-term debt, more specifically like 6 to 7 year debt on average. So the Fed funds rate is relevant. That's the overnight lending rate. Okay, so we shouldn't focus on it. But regardless, you can see that even with that, you need the blue line to move first, which allows for the red line to move after, which is the Fed funds rate. The blue line is the 2-year Treasury yield, which is the front end of the yield curve. So if we're looking at the deficit itself, being 1.83 trillion. And I'm sure you've heard many people talk about this, such as Ray Dalio and so on. They're talking about how this is completely unsustainable and this is going to lead to painful consequences down the road, right? Or down the line. And I believe so as well, but not to the extent that people are expecting. And I'm gonna present my argument in this video. So it's important to understand that when the Federal Reserve engages in open market operations, and I'm talking about this, here's the Fed's balance sheet. Okay, this number, right? This is quantitative easing. They buy treasuries and they buy mortgage-backed securities. How does this work? The Federal Reserve can only engage in QE, which is open market operations, when the Fed funds rate overnight lending rate is zero, which is determined by the 2-year yield. They're only allowed to buy treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which are guaranteed by the US taxpayer and the US government. Okay, so that's the way this moves up. So this is QE1, QE2, and QE3. All right. And then you had QE4 here, QE infinity during COVID. Okay. And then ever since then, we have seen the balance sheet go down from 8.9 trillion down to 6.6 trillion. So if this goes up by 6.6 trillion, a lot of people think that M2 money supply, which is this, would go up by equivalent amount. But that's not true. I'm going to present my case. Okay. If the Federal Reserve engages in open market operations and let's say they do $1 trillion of uh, treasury securities purchases, yeah, then this is how the distribution looks from when it comes to who they're buying from, right? Or who has a share in the treasury market right now. 42% is from domestic non-banks, which would be a full M2 impact, right? 33% is from foreign investors. Roughly 10% of that number would pass through to M2, okay? 8% from banks, which if they're buying from the banks, it only increases the bank reserves, which does not increase the money supply. And then the remaining is held by the Fed. All right, so we're just gonna ignore that. But it's just the distribution when it comes to who has treasuries, right? So it's very important to differentiate who they're buying from. If they're buying from domestic non-banks, it will impact M2 money supply. Okay, so then the money supply will go up. All right. If you have bonds and you sell it on the open market and it just so happens to be that the Federal Reserve is the buyer, it will increase the M2 money supply. What are you likely to go and do with it? Well, I don't know about you, but if you have bonds, then you're probably gonna buy assets with it instead of consuming in the real economy like the average person would, like crazy. Right? For example, we saw this during COVID when they gave out the stimulus checks. It had more of a impact on the consumer price inflation index, right? Whereas QE 1, 2, and 3 barely had any impact on inflation. Why? Because most of that went into assets and inflated asset prices. So QE is primarily asset price inflationary. So the final answer is if the Fed buys 1 trillion in treasuries without targeting the seller type, M2 would increase by approximately 2.1%. Okay, so I'm going to use the quantity theory of money and everything to come to the conclusion of how bad this could get when it comes to inflationary impacts. But I'll do that in a sec. So if the Federal Reserve buys 1 trillion treasuries and doesn't target to the buyers, for example, if the market sells to the Fed through primary dealers, we need to estimate the average share of each seller type, right? So here you have them, right? As it says right here, only the non-bank domestic portion contributes fully to M2. Foreign sellers contribute partially. Banks contribute nothing to M2 because again, it's bank reserves. If the Fed was to monetize half of, okay, let's say the Fed funds rate drops down to 1% and we bring in 300 billion. Well, I don't live in the US, but I'm just doing the calculation, right? It's not true what Donald Trump is saying. You wouldn't save $1 trillion in interest every single year because again, most of it is not affected by the Fed funds rate, overnight lending rate. If the Fed was to monetize half of a $1.2 trillion deficit, which is what it would get it down to, if the Fed funds rate drops to 1%, let's say, and you have 300 billion in tariff revenue, then let's say they buy 600 billion in treasuries. How much would M2 grow by year over year? Accounting for what portion actually affects M2, going back to this, right? The distribution here. So this is not updated, but it's close enough, right? It's 21.9 trillion right now, not 21.5, but you get the idea. If this is the money supply, and the Fed buys 600 billion in treasuries on the secondary market, injecting base money, this is how it would affect this, right? Meaning 45.3% of the overall purchase of securities would increase the money supply. So 45% of this number, assuming they monetize half the deficit, which is realistic, during QE 1, 2, and 3, you saw this. It's normal to see between a 30 to 50% monetization of the deficit, okay? So what would 45.3% be of that overall number, right? And its impact on the M2 money supply growth rate year over year. That would be 1.26%. So if the Fed monetizes 600 billion of a $1.2 trillion deficit, again, similar to Q1, 2, and 3, and purchases follow normal market composition, it would likely increase M2 by about 1.26% year over year. I'm from Sweden, if I have bonds and the Fed buys it in the open market, does it increase the money supply, US M2? No, it doesn't, because I'm not a part of the US banking system. Okay, same thing with the banks. It's just bank reserves. Doesn't increase the money supply. So you can't just think, oh, they're just going to monetize the whole deficit. No, they would likely monetize about half of it, and it would increase the money supply by 45% of that purchase amount. Okay, because of the distribution, it's really important to understand this. So here is the Fed funds rate, and people go, oh well, if they drop rates to very low levels, we're going to have hyperinflation, right? Are you sure about that? Here is 2008 to 2015. This is a 7-year period, okay, from late 2008 to late 2015. What was inflation? What was the CPI year over year? It was averaging about 2%. It's not true that if you drop rates to a low level, the overnight lending rate, that the money supply explodes. No, interest rates are not relevant. Number one, why do interest rates get down to that level? It's because people are buying bonds. Again, going back to the picture I compared with the Fed funds rate versus the 2-year yield. The way you get interest rates down is by buying bonds. If people buy bonds, it means that liquidity is going down, not up, by the way. Okay? So why? Because for you to buy those bonds, the money needs to come from somewhere. That would likely come from the stock market, etc. Right? And if people are buying bonds, it's because they're concerned about something. So it tells you a lot about liquidity conditions, right? Getting rates down to 0%. Again, if you're hyperfixating on the price of money, you're going to be confused. You need to think and you need to consider the availability of credit. Okay, just because rates are low, it doesn't mean that the bank is going to lend to you. Good luck getting a loan right here in 2008, 2009. It wasn't possible for most people. Actually, it was possible for a lot of people, but a lot of people also couldn't get loans because the banks didn't want to lend because it wasn't worth it from a risk-reward perspective. So it's not true that if rates drop to low levels, you're going to have hyperinflation. Everyone says, oh, if the Fed drops rates, you're going to have hyperinflation, which, by the way, they would have to drop it to literally zero to even do QE to begin with. Okay, it's an emergency tool. Jerome Powell has talked about this multiple times. They are not allowed to do QE or yield curve control. So QE being quantitative easing, modern day money printing, if you want to call it that. It's not money printing, no. Okay? What's the difference between money printing, like actual money printing, and quantitative easing? Number one, quantitative easing is reversible. Okay, it's simply just the balance sheet expansion, right? The Fed is buying treasuries, mortgage-backed securities. This is reversible. Here it went down a bit. Here it's gone down a bit. Okay, so this is reverse money printing, if you want to call it money printing, right? Same thing when commercial banks lend money into existence. It's just a loan. What happens when you pay off the loan? The money's gone. Poof. The only reason why the money supply keeps growing like this over time is because more loans are given out than are being paid off. But if you look at the balance sheet, right, this is reversible, and same thing with the commercial banks lending money into existence. So, what is actual money printing? Well, that's in like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Turkey, Argentina. They are printing green pieces of paper. So if the supply, if the demand for those currency units go down, the supply cannot go away. But if the demand for dollars go away, what happens? The supply can actually go down because when they pay off a loan, the dollars are gone. Okay? So there's a big difference between a monetary system in the Eurodollar system versus the rest of the world. Massive difference. Okay? So don't get confused. Don't think that, oh, just because rates drop to a low level, it means that we're going to have hyperinflation. No, there was like no inflation here. Same thing here. Here's Sweden's interest rates, okay? So the purple horizontal line is 0% interest rates. We went down to minus half a percent interest. You got paid to borrow money here between 2015 to 2019. Our inflation rate, you can see it here on the left side, was between negative 0.5 up to like plus 2% during this time. So it doesn't guarantee hyperinflation. What about right here in Japan? Minus 0.1% interest rates. They had negative interest rates. What was the inflation rate? Between minus like 1.2 or something up to plus 1.5 during this period from 2016 to 2024. Sure, it went up here, but again, the inflation spike was because the central banks were inflating the money supply, right, by buying treasuries from the general public, which put hands into the average person, which put money into the average person, and obviously that's going to cause inflation, but it has nothing to do with interest rates itself, right? So when people are hyper fixated in saying, oh, if they drop rates to zero, we're going to have this massive inflation spike, it's not true. History doesn't align with this. Okay, let's go over to the quantity theory of money. Okay, the quantity theory of money states that you have to factor in multiple things: M2 money supply growth rate year over year, M2 money supply velocity. Okay, so that's this chart right here. M2V is the ticker. Okay, the velocity is simply just it represents whether the money is actually flowing through the economy in a healthy manner, right? If this is on a downtrend like it's been since 1997, it's indicative of malinvestments. The money is going to the wrong places. People are not spending it. Okay, this is not a good sign. In fact, you even had it right here in the 1930s. If I can find a picture for you, yeah, here it is. Between 1918 to 1932, this went from a ratio of 1.95 to 1.17. Okay, just like this has dropped from 2.192 down to 1.128. Why did it drop off like crazy during COVID? Because people were locked in their homes and they were told that they couldn't spend the money in the real economy at that point, right? Then it started to bottom out here, and then it went up, and this is when the inflation hit. And is this visible if you could just compare it like this? Yes, it is. If we go to this is the M2 money supply on the Fed website, we click on percent change from a year ago, right? You can see that in February of 2021, the money supply was growing at a rate of 26.7% year over year. The inflation rate in the US was growing at the rate of inflation rate. In February of 2021, right, when this was peaking, inflation was 1.7%. Why did it come after? Because the velocity started to go up, okay? The economy opened back up. People got to spend the money that they were given, right? So that's why there was a big lag effect, right? So going back to the quantity theory of money, you have to factor in, again, if you're looking at the money supply growth rate year over year, which is currently 4.5%, and then we look at the velocity of money, which is currently rolling over. Again, this is updated quarterly. The money supply is updated monthly. This has been in a downtrend since 1997, okay, for 28 years. I don't see why this would all of a sudden stop. Right now, it's still positive year over year, okay, for now it is, but it's heading downwards again, okay. This offsets inflation. Let me give an example, okay. If the money supply is growing at a rate of, let's say, 6%, you would think, oh, you would have 6% inflation. No, you have 6% currency debasement. Currency debasement is not the same as inflation. It's a big difference. Because yes, while we might have, I know it says 4.5, that's what we have right now year over year, but let's say for the sake of this example, 6% M2 growth rate year over year, like we had right here in 2013, right? If the economy is growing, as in GDP is growing, we also have more stuff. We have more goods and services. So yes, there are more dollars in circulation, but we also have more stuff. Okay? So the supply of dollars are going up, but the supply of stuff is also going up, which offsets some of this logical inflation that you would think would happen just by looking at the currency debasement itself. Then the third thing is the velocity. Okay? So the velocity matters a lot. On average, throughout the 2010s, this was averaging about minus 2%, the money velocity, okay? Meaning, again, going back to this number, if the M2 money supply is growing at the rate of 6%, GDP, let's say real GDP, again, you have to specifically focus on real GDP. Let's say that's 2.5%. So you take 6% M2 money supply growth rate year over year, okay? Minus 2.5%, that's the real GDP. And then let's say the average velocity was minus 2% of the decline, right? Then you have 1.5% inflation, roughly. Why? 6% money supply growth, minus 2.5%, because the real GDP offsets that, okay? Minus 2% from money velocity going down. That's the quantity theory of money. This is how inflation should be calculated. It's logical. Now, if the Federal Reserve was to engage in open market operations and increase the money supply by 1.26% on top of this number, and then the Fed funds rate goes down, M2 money supply might grow at a rate of, I don't know, let's say 6 to 6.5%. You might think, oh no, if rates drop to zero, the money supply will explode. Rates were zero here this whole time, okay? What was the money supply averaging on average? 6%. Velocity was declining at the rate of 2%, and real GDP was 2%. So you had 2% inflation. That's how you got to that number. Currency debasement is not the same as inflation. But let's add 1.26% on top of this from this example of the Fed monetizing half the deficit, if it's a $1.2 trillion deficit, right? Cutting the rates, the Fed funds rate, specifically overnight lending rate, down to 1%. And then we have, we're monetizing the debt, right? We're monetizing the deficit. You would add 1.26% on top of this, plus you could speculate on maybe 0.5 to 1% increase beyond that because the rates are lower, right? But again, the price of money is not the same as the availability of credit, okay? You're going to think logically, oh, the money supply will expand. It won't. History tells us that. I brought up 3 examples. The US between 2008 to 2015, and then Sweden and Japan. We have seen this. We have tried this experiment. We know what it leads to, okay? So 1.26% on top of this would be 5.7%. We add, I don't know, let's say another 0.8% because the Fed funds rate drops. So 6.5%. Okay, and now let's say real GDP is 2.5%. What would the inflation rate be? 4%. Okay, but then what's the third factor? Velocity. If velocity is declining, and again, I think this is going to go negative. If this is declining at a rate of 2% on average per year, like in the 2010s, inflation will be what? 2.5%. So are you really going to have hyperinflation with low rates and with the Fed monetizing the deficit? The math would suggest no. So this idea of, oh, the Fed is going to balloon the balance sheet, we're going to get hyperinflation, I don't see it. Where's the math behind it? Most people are completely ignoring velocity as well. You're just looking, you're hyperfixating on the price of money, which is the interest rates, instead of the availability of credit. People are confusing inflation with currency debasement. And then what's the next thing? A lot of people think that things such as tariffs are inflationary. Tariffs are a tax. Taxes are not inflationary. Why are tariffs not inflationary? You might say, no, they are. No, the issue is that you don't understand the terminology. Inflation, by definition, is inflating the money supply, which increases the general price level. If you tariff certain goods, the price of those goods go up. I agree. There's a price increase for those goods. But the consumer still has $3,000 to spend. And so what happens? They spend less on something else. And the general price level stays the same. Without new money, because the money supply is exploding, you will not see the inflation that everyone is speculating on. It's not possible. Okay? And again, factor in the quantity theory of money. The M2 money supply growth rate year over year minus the plus or minus the M2 money supply velocity change year over year, whether it's positive or negative. It's been on a downtrend since 1997. It's gotten cut in half. And then real GDP. So again, for one last time, if the money supply is growing at the rate of 6.5%, real GDP is 2.5%. You offset 2.5% from that money supply growth, which means you have 4% inflation. Assuming the money velocity, M2V, is stagnant. But if it's negative 2% year over year when it comes to percentage change, then what happens? The inflation rate is 2%. That's what we saw in the 2010s. All right, enough for this rant. Take care.